I'm pregnant and my boyfriend wants to leave me because I told him I want the child to be named after my ex, the love of my life. He doesn't want to. He doesn't see that you are being irrational. The day I signed the registry papers and put my ex name on my son's birth certificate, the biological father was not even there. My mom looked at me as if she were witnessing an accident in slow motion, and an aunt muttered that I was condemning myself to a life of trouble. Now I have a baby in my arms, an ex-boyfriend who disappeared from my life years ago, and a man who could have been my family sleeping somewhere else, because he says he cannot stand what I did, and everyone swears that I'm the monster of this story. Believe it or not, for me all this started trying to be honest with what I felt, even if nobody likes to hear it. I have always had the feeling that I love differently from others. It is not just a dramatic phrase. I truly feel it that way, as if what happens inside me had another intensity, another depth. When I was with Fernando, everything in my life arranged itself around that idea. It was not a long relationship, nor perfect, let alone healthy if I get rational, but in my head it became a sort of before and after. He was not just an ex, he was the person with whom I felt that for the first time I was completely disarmed. We argued, we hurt each other, we drifted apart, but there was something almost electric that no subsequent relationship has had. When everything ended badly, with screams and silences and each going their own way, I did not close that chapter, I turned it into a myth. While others said I had to get over it, I thought what I had with him was precisely what people dream of and do not dare to have. So I committed what for many would be a mistake, but for me was a kind of loyalty. I named him, spoke of our anecdotes, recounted the details as if I were narrating a movie. It was not that I wanted to get back with him, it was that I felt denying the importance of what we lived was betraying myself. There were other attempts at relationships, fleeting relationships, dates that came to nothing because inevitably I compared them to Fernando, and they always fell short. I knew it, but I felt that at least I was being sincere with myself. Carlos appeared at a stage when I was already tired of the drama. He was everything Fernando was not: stable, patient, hardworking, with clear life plans. My chest did not explode when I met him. There was no such internal storm, but there was something rare. Peace. At first it seemed boring to me, I admit it, but at the same time I was afraid of losing that peace I had never had with anyone. So I allowed myself to stay, to try what a love that does not destroy you every day was like, and little by little I found a safe place in him. From the beginning I was very clear with Carlos regarding my past. I told him about Fernando. I told him he had been the great love of my life, that he had marked me in every sense. He listened, asked some questions, remained calm. I interpreted that calm as maturity, as proof that he was not an insecure man. I even came to think it was beautiful that he could accept that before him there was someone important, because in the end we all have history. From time to time, in casual conversations, I mentioned Fernando like someone speaking of a personal legend, and Carlos just smiled with that face half resigned, half kind. He never questioned it seriously, so I assumed it was not a problem. Over time, the relationship with Carlos became very functional. We went out, made plans, talked about the future, moving, saving. He was one of those who wake up early on a Sunday to fix things around the house, who worries about paying bills on time, who keeps receipts in folders. There was not that fire I had known, but there was a feeling that finally someone was building something concrete with me. When I found out I was pregnant, his reaction finished confirming it. He got emotional, cried, hugged me as if he had been given the best news of his life. I cried too, but for another reason. I felt the universe was giving me a chance to unite that intense love I always defended with the stability I had finally found. The first months of pregnancy were a bubble. Carlos was attentive to every craving, every medical appointment, every little discomfort. He took photos of me with my belly barely showing. He talked to me about what the baby room would be like, kept ultrasounds like treasures. I started to imagine a future where finally my capacity to love would find a channel, a son arriving at a relatively tidy home, with a present father and a mother who, yes, had an intense past, but who was now ready to do things right. At least that is what I believed. What nobody understands is that pregnancy also makes you very vulnerable, very sensitive, and for me it stirred up all the memories. I started dreaming a lot about my life before, about the extreme moments with Fernando. It was not that I wanted to return to that relationship, but I found myself thinking about how that story had shaped the person who was now bringing a child into the world. It seemed unfair to me to pretend that part of my story did not exist just because I was now with Carlos. For me, denying that was like erasing half of my identity. One day, on one of those quiet sofa afternoons, Carlos brought up the subject of names. He did it with excitement. He talked about names that reminded him of his grandfather, book characters, even soccer players. I listened to him, but I felt those names fell short, that they had no weight. When he asked me what name I would like, I felt it was the moment to be coherent with everything I had always defended. So I said what my heart had already decided a long time ago, that I wanted our son to be named Fernando. There was a rare silence. I did not say it as a provocation. I said it calmly, explaining that that name represented something very deep for me, that it was a sort of homage to a part of my life that I did not want to erase just because it was uncomfortable. I told him that that love, the one I had with Fernando, had been so big that it seemed beautiful to me to transform it into something new in the life of our son, instead of burying it as if it had been a mistake. For me it was poetic, even healing. I was convinced that if Carlos truly loved me, he would understand that it was not about preferring another man, but about recognizing what made me who I'm now. Carlos' response was like a bucket of cold water. He looked at me with a mix of surprise, pain, and something I had not seen in him before, resentment. He told me he was not willing to raise another man-child symbolically, that naming the baby Fernando was like tattooing on his forehead that he, Carlos, was always going to be the replacement. He said he felt I had never put him in first place, that from the beginning he had accepted being the calm option after the hurricane, but reaching the point of giving the baby the name of my great love seemed like a humiliation to him. I was in shock because in my head I was sharing something sincere and deep, and he was twisting it into an ego issue. I tried to explain that it was not that I chose him every day, that the baby was his, that precisely because I was with him I felt safe to honor my past without that threatening our present. I told him only mediocre people try to erase what they loved before, that I was not going to pretend Fernando did not exist just to not hurt feelings. Carlos replied that one thing was recognizing the past and another thing was bringing it to the center of our family life, putting his name on the crib, at school, on every document. He accused me of living trapped in a novel and using the pregnancy as a stage for my romantic ideas. From there, nothing was ever the same. We started arguing about anything, but we always ended up returning to the subject of the name. I felt he was asking me to amputate a part of myself, to become one of those women who say nobody before mattered just so the man feels comfortable. He, on the other hand, said the least he could expect from the mother of his child was that she did not try to put another man in the equation, even on the birth certificate. Every time I tried to argue from the emotional side, he counterattacked with phrases like I did not understand respect, that I was using him as plan B. Hearing him say that hurt, because at no moment have I felt he is a consolation prize. It is simply a different type of love. The nights became silent torture, where before he hugged me from behind and put his hand on my belly, now he slept on the edge of the bed, rigid, or went directly to the sofa. There was one night in particular that marked me. I had an aching back, unable to find a position, and I asked him to stay with me to talk. He told me he no longer knew what to say, that he was tired of feeling he competed with a ghost, and took his pillow to the guest room. I heard the door close and felt for the first time that something had truly broken between us. He started arriving late from work, answering dryly, avoiding deep conversations. When we talked about the baby, it was in practical terms: diapers, medical appointments, money. The name issue became a void between the two, something neither wanted to touch, but was in every breath. I saw him drifting away. Instead of asking myself if perhaps I had gone too far, I became more convinced the problem was he did not know how to love at the level of what I offered. I told myself any man who truly knew me would understand I could not rewrite my story for his convenience. One day, after another argument where we ended up shouting things that are not easy to forget, Carlos said something that froze my blood. He said he was seriously thinking about leaving, that it was not clear to him if he wanted to continue in a relationship where he was always going to feel he was sharing the house with Fernando Shadow. He clarified he was not going to abandon his son, but he was not obliged to endure the idea of introducing his child with the name of another man I called the love of my life. That phrase stuck in my head like an unfair accusation. Me, pregnant, vulnerable, listening to the father of my child talk about leaving because he could not stand how I loved. In my head, the role reversed immediately. It was no longer I who was doing something questionable, it was he who was failing. I saw myself as a woman punished for feeling too much, punished for daring not to lie about her past. I started telling the story in those terms even to myself, a honest, deep woman who dares to name what others hide and a man who shrinks before discomfort and seeks the easy way out. Every night he slept in another room, I interpreted it as one more proof that the world cannot stand women who love with intensity. And instead of rethinking my decisions, I promised myself I was not going to give in, that I would find a way to prove I was not trapped in the past, that everyone was wrong except me. Anonymous user 1 says, "Truly, I do not understand how you can write all this and still be convinced you are the victim. Carlos is right to feel used. You are making it clear he will always live in Fernando's shadow, and on top of that you want him to see it as something poetic. It is not deepening love. It is nailing a daily reminder that he was never your first option." Response from the OP. What you call a reminder, I see as honesty. I prefer 1,000 times to build a family on uncomfortable truths than on cheap fairy tales. If he needs me to erase entire parts of my life to feel safe, then maybe he was never really prepared to be with me. I'm not going to lower what I felt just so someone does not get uncomfortable with a name. Anonymous user 2 says, "You say you love differently, but in fact it sounds more like ego than anything else. You are using your son as a symbol to close a story that you alone turned into a myth. Carlos is not asking you to pretend Fernando did not exist, just not to put him through the window into the baby life. That is not lack of love, it is common sense." Response from the OP. It is always very easy to talk about common sense from the outside without carrying another person's emotions. My son is also part of my story, of what I was and what I'm. I'm not using him. I'm giving him a meaning that for me is important. That to others it seems exaggerated does not automatically turn my motives into selfish ones. It just means they do not share them. Anonymous user 3 says, "The problem is not just the name, it is the whole dynamic. You have put Fernando on a pedestal, you repeat him like a legend and expect Carlos to live happily with that emotional altar. Then you are surprised he steps aside when you propose naming the baby like that same man. That is not being a true woman, it is refusing to see the damage you do." Response from the OP. Nobody sees that if Fernando is on a pedestal it is because he was part of what made me get to where I'm now, even to this maternity. I'm not asking Carlos to worship my past, only to respect it. If he decides to feel damaged by something that for me is a gesture of coherence, I cannot live my whole life editing myself to accommodate every insecurity of others. I also have the right for my story to have continuity, even if others find it uncomfortable. Update 1. After everything that happened with Carlos and the name issue, I kept turning over an idea that surely everyone here is going to call crazy, but that in my head was the only coherent exit. If the big problem was he felt he lived competing with a ghost, the logical thing was to face that ghost head on. I thought if I ensured that the thing with Fernando and me was really closed, then nobody could say the baby name was a threat. For me it was not a question of fidelity or infidelity, it was a question of emotional honesty. I could not bring a child into this world leaving loose ends in my own story. So I started thinking of Fernando not as the love I lost, but as a pending chapter one had to order before becoming a mother. I remembered I had blocked him everywhere for a long time, but mutual friends still exist, networks exist, emails exist. It is not so hard to find someone if you really want to. One night, while Carlos slept in the guest room, with the door closed as if I were a stranger, I stayed with the cell phone in my hand, feeling how the baby moved and thinking I could not keep letting others define what was correct in my own story. I looked for Fernando profile, found a way to write to him, and started drafting a message that was not mediocre or superficial. That message was not short or casual. I told him I was pregnant, that my life had changed, but that he was still, like it or not, the great love that marked who I'm. I explained I was not trying to return, that I did not want to ruin anything if he was with someone, but that I needed real closure. I spoke to him about the baby name as an idea that arose from a deep place, as a way to transform something that was intense and painful into something new and clean. I told him I was trying to move forward, but that moving forward does not mean denying what made you tremble once. I felt for the first time in a long time I was putting into words everything I had always kept quiet. The response did not arrive immediately, and those days were strange. Carlos remained distant, sleeping in another room, and I acted like I was just watching videos on the phone when in reality I checked every little while if Fernando had replied. When he finally did, the feeling was a mix of nerves and relief. His message was short, cold, even. He said he was glad my life was moving forward, that he had heard I was with someone stable, and that now he also had a partner and an orderly life. He added that what I told him made him very uncomfortable, that he did not think it was a good idea to keep talking, and the best thing was for each to follow their path. Any other person would have taken that as a resounding no, but I do not work like that. I felt he was responding from fear, from discomfort, not from what he really felt. I noticed the words he chose, how he did not deny what we lived was big, just said he now had another life. In my head that sounded like someone who still shakes off the memory. I interpreted his doubts, his evasiveness, as proof there were unresolved things between us. And if there were unresolved things, then it was even more urgent we talked before the baby was born. I could not enter maternity dragging silences. I wrote to him again more calmly, but also with more decision. I told him I did not want to invade his life or disrespect anyone, that I only needed to see him one more time to close well what was never closed. I proposed meeting in a discreet cafeteria, in broad daylight, nothing weird. I insisted I was not asking for a second chance, but giving both of us the chance to say goodbye like adults. In my mind, that meeting had nothing romantic in the conventional sense. It was rather an act of cleaning, of emotional maturity. If after seeing him face to face I felt there was nothing left, then the name would stop being a problem for anyone because it would be just a symbol, not a danger. Obviously, I did not tell Carlos any of this, not because I felt I was betraying him, but precisely because I know how people are. I know if I told him I was going to see the man who was the love of my life, he was going to interpret it as emotional infidelity. He was going to make a scene, and the subject could no longer be discussed with serenity. I preferred to think I was protecting our relationship by handling this alone. When Fernando finally accepted, with a message full of caution and phrases like he was coming only so we left everything clear, I felt I was making him responsible. I thought if everything went well, later I could tell Carlos I had had that closure, that there were no more ghosts, and then the name would not have reason to be a cause for war. While we set date and time for the cafeteria, I felt the baby move and repeated to myself I was doing this for him, for us as a family, to not load him with my unfinished stories. If everyone accuses me of being trapped in the past, what is wrong with facing that past directly and proving it no longer dominates me? Maybe from the outside it looks like unnecessary drama, but from where I live it, it was the only way not to enter maternity feeling I left something unsaid to the person who turned me, for better or worse, into who I'm now. From that meeting, I was sure everything would be ordered, even the Carlos thing. Comments. Update 1. Anonymous user 1 says, seeking Fernando while you are pregnant by another man and on top have a relationship is exactly what any healthy person would call betrayal, even if there are no kisses or anything physical. It is not an act of emotional cleaning, it is reopening a wound you yourself refuse to let heal, and justifying it saying you do it for the baby only makes it more grave. Response from the OP. The easy thing is calling it betrayal from the outside and keeping the simple version of things. I'm carrying a very intense story and a pregnancy at the same time, and I know perfectly well if I did not close that stage well it was going to keep contaminating everything. I prefer facing the person who marked my life and making sure where I stand than keep pretending he does not exist while accumulating silent resentments that in the end would also end up damaging my son. Anonymous user 2 says, You say you protect your relationship by hiding from Carlos that you are going to see the man you keep calling the love of your life. That is not protecting anything, it is taking away from him the possibility to decide if he wants to be with someone who needs those types of closures. You are treating him like a child who cannot know the truth while you play at being the superior adult. Response from the OP. If I had told him, you know perfectly how he would have reacted. Drama, reproaches, threats of leaving, more distance. And then yes, all the focus would have gone to the scandal and not to what I needed to clarify. It is not about treating anyone like a child. It is that some conversations must be had first with oneself and with the person involved, and then, when everything is clear, see what is shared. Not everything one processes internally has to pass through the partner approval. Anonymous User 3 says, whether you cling to the word closure or not, what you are doing is continuing to feed that idea that Fernando is this great axis of your life. Instead of building something new with Carlos, you dedicate yourself to orbiting around this same myth and drag a baby into that orbit. If you really wanted to move forward, you would have set limits years ago. Would you not organize a secret date in a cafeteria? Response from the OP. It is very easy to talk about limits when you are not the one who lives something that changed the way you feel. I'm not organizing a romantic date. I'm facing the myth head-on to see what remains of it. Only when I look Fernando in the eyes and see what really is there now, will I be able to know if I keep orbiting or if finally everything reduces to what it is, a chapter that ended. The problem is people prefer one acts like nothing existed before, and I'm not going to live anesthetizing what I feel just to fit into that idea. Update 2. The day of the meeting arrived much faster than I expected. I chose a remote cafeteria, one of those where almost nobody knows you, as if I were organizing a sort of delicate operation and not a simple coffee. I dressed up more than necessary, I admit, but not for flirting, but because I wanted him to see what everything we lived and what came after had turned me into. I went early, sat by the window, and felt my son move as if he were also restless about what was going to happen. I had reviewed in my head 1,000 times what I wanted to tell him, how to explain that naming the baby after him was for me an act of transformation and not an attempt at replacement. When Fernando arrived, he looked different, calmer, more adult, with another energy. He was not the hurricane I remembered, but someone who had found a more linear route. We greeted each other with that discomfort of those who share too much history and at the same time have not seen each other for a long time. I started telling him superficial things about the pregnancy, my work, life with Carlos before all this chaos. He listened, but I felt he was raising an invisible wall between us. So I decided to get to the point and spoke of the true reason why I had called him. I explained with the greatest calm I could that for me what we lived was never something that could be labeled as a mistake. That it had been intense. Yes. That we had hurt each other, but that it had also taught me to feel in a way not everyone experiences. I told him now that I was going to have a son. It seemed almost logical to me that the name carrying most weight in my story was linked to that new life. I presented it as a sort of tribute, a way to take something that at the time was chaos and convert it into something clean and new. In my head it sounded spiritual, almost poetic. While I spoke, I saw his face tensing up. Fernando did not see it that way, not even close. He told me what I was proposing seemed profoundly inappropriate to him, that he was now with Daniela, that they had a stable life, that they were making future plans, and that he did not want his name ending up entangled in a drama that did not belong to him. He added it seemed like a lack of respect towards Carlos and even towards the baby itself, who would arrive in the world carrying a backpack he did not ask for. He said what I called homage sounded more like a poorly managed obsession to him. Hearing that word hurt because I felt he was reducing everything to something ugly, as if what I felt had no nuances. I left that cafeteria with a mix of frustration and rage. On one hand, I had had the courage to look him in the face and tell him what nobody dares say out loud about their great loves. On the other, he hid behind his new life, his relationship with Daniela, as if that authorized him to disengage from what he meant to me. Even so, I felt the closure was done. He had made it clear he was not going to participate in this and did not want his name in the center of anything. Perfect. Just for that, I thought, now that name could be only mine and my son's, without depending on him. The ironic thing is matters did not end there. A short time later, Daniela entered the scene in a way I had not anticipated. Apparently she checked Fernando's phone or saw notifications, I do not know, but she ended up reading everything we had talked about. She wrote me a long message full of reproaches, accusing me of trying to destroy a relationship that lasted years, of using my pregnancy as an excuse to make a sort of cheap soap opera, of wanting to sneak her partner into my life through the child name. She told me I was not well, that I needed help, to stop romanticizing things that only did damage. Reading that, I could not help feeling the world is full of people who hate women when they feel strongly. Instead of understanding I was dealing with something very complex, Daniela decided to paint me as the villain knocking on others' doors to create chaos. I replied trying to explain, but it was useless. She was in total defense mode, saying if I kept bothering she was going to tell whoever necessary what I was doing. It seemed a disproportionate reaction to me, almost violent, for a situation that in the end was limited to a coffee and some sincere messages. But that is how people are when facing someone who feels differently. They attack first, ask later. The worst was when all that reached Carlos' ears. I do not know if it was through a mutual friend, some crossed comment, or because someone showed him the messages, but the case is one day he arrived home with an expression I had never seen on him. It was not just sadness or anger, it was a sort of broken resignation. He asked me directly if I had gone to see Fernando in secret while he slept in the guest room and I was pregnant with our son. I could not deny it. I tried to explain I did it for closure, for emotional responsibility, that I needed to confirm what I felt now for Carlos and the baby was a new chapter. For him, my explanation meant nothing. He said the only thing he saw was the woman with whom he was going to form a family sitting with another man she called the great love of her life, to talk about naming the child he was expecting after him. He said it was not a deep symbol, it was a humiliation. That same week he started packing his things. He told me he was not going to leave his son without a father, that he was going to be present in everything needed, that he would assume economically what corresponded, but as a couple it was over. Seeing him take his clothes out of the closet and pack his toothbrush, while I had a huge belly, was like seeing a building I thought was solid collapse. And even so, while I watched him go with a suitcase in hand, there was a part of me thinking everyone was exaggerating, that yes, maybe it had not been the most comfortable way to handle things, but in the end I had only tried to be coherent with my story, ensuring I was not living a lie, that Carlos running away before that, while Fernando and Daniela protected themselves with speeches of normality, did nothing but reinforce my idea that nobody is prepared for a woman who refuses to trim her emotions to fit into the mold. Comments. Update 2. Anonymous user 1 says, you wanna see Fernando, propose the idea of the name, and on top keep thinking everyone exaggerates. Fernando set a very clear limit for you. Daniela defended her relationship and Carlos simply refused to participate in your romantic fantasy. It is not that the world hates women who feel strongly, it is that nobody wants to be a prop in your personal play. Response from the OP. It is very comfortable to talk about limits when standing on the side risking nothing. Fernando protected himself. Daniela too, Carlos the same. The only point where someone tried to face things head-on was me. Nobody wants to get uncomfortable. Everyone prefers clean stories where the past is erased as if it never existed. I understand they defend themselves, but that does not automatically turn what I feel into a fantasy. Anonymous user 1 says, you say the name would be only yours and your son's, but in reality you're ignoring there is a father who also exists. Carlos saw the mother of his son chase another man to give her validation and on top use that same man as inspiration for the baby name. It is not fleeing, it is putting a limit to something objectively cruel. Response from the OP. Carlos always knew my story, did not start with him, and still decided to enter. I did not ask him to be a tragic hero, just to understand my life did not start the day I met him. If he decides to interpret everything from the most painful place possible, it is no longer something I can control. I'm not seeking validation, I'm seeking coherence. That the baby father cannot tolerate that says much more about his insecurities than my decisions. Anonymous user 3 says, The Daniela thing was not violence, it was a logical reaction to a woman trying to put her partner in the center of someone else's drama. She warned you she was going to talk if you kept insisting and ended up doing it. You are not being persecuted for feeling differently. You are receiving consequences for not accepting your great love already passed, and now there are other people involved. Response from the OP, Daniela reacted defending hers. I understand, but she did it from a position where it was easy to reduce everything to the label of drama of others. For me, it is not as simple as saying something already passed and that is it. Especially when that something went through you the way it went through me. That there are more people involved does not mean I have to give up giving meaning to my own story. They chose the comfortable version. I chose facing the uncomfortable, and clearly, that bothers. Update 3. What I did not expect was the thing becoming a shared spectacle. Daniela apparently got tired of dealing with me in private and decided to tell her version in a group of mutual friends. She shared fragments of the messages, those where I spoke of Fernando as the great love of my life while describing my pregnancy, and where I explained the name thing as a sort of homage. From there, everything was passed from chat to chat, as usually happens when someone feels they have moral authority to expose another. What for me was an intense and private conversation became suddenly a topic of debate for people who were not even there. Before long, some people from my family started calling me with that voice of fake concern that is actually pure judgment disguised. An aunt told me she could not believe I was thinking of naming the baby after an ex, even less one I kept idealizing. A cousin was more direct and told me I was being cruel to Carlos, that I was using the child as an extension of a story that was already dead. Even my mother, who usually avoids meddling, ended up saying she understood I had loved Fernando, but that did not give me the right to drag an innocent to that altar. At no moment did I feel anyone tried to understand where all this came from. They just wanted it to fit into their idea of decency. I listened to all that and, instead of feeling shame, felt a mix of rage and loneliness. From their perspective, clearly, it was easy to say I was being pathetic, clinging to an adolescent love, but none of them were there when I felt the invisible bones of my chest break, nor when, years later, I kept dealing with the consequences of that intensity. They just saw the messages filtered out of context and drew quick conclusions. I started feeling everyone aligning against me, that nobody was willing even to consider my way of loving was legitimate, even if not the most comfortable to observe from outside. Carlos, seeing the topic had escalated and already all the people around had an opinion, closed off even more. He summoned me to talk in a cafe close to the house, but this time there was no tenderness or illusion, only formality. He told me what hurt him most was not just the name, nor even the date with Fernando, but the way I had turned all this into a story where he always appeared as the gray man who understands nothing. He said he did not want to be the secondary character of my romantic epic. He clarified again he would be there as a father, was going to register him, support him, see him, but did not plan on continuing to be my partner nor entering any future discussion on how he should feel regarding the child. It was like hearing a sentence. There were no screams, no drama. Just a very clear line drawn between us. I tried to tell him people were exaggerating, that messages could be read in 1,000 ways, that nobody understood the context. He replied he did not need anyone to explain it to him, that the simple idea I could think of naming the baby Fernando, added to everything he had discovered, was sufficient to understand he did not occupy the place he thought. He repeated he did not want his son becoming a reminder of someone else's story. From there, interactions with Carlos became almost bureaucratic. We talked about medical appointments, money, procedures, but anything minimally emotional was blocked. If I tried talking about the name, he said he did not want to enter that he already knew what my position was and did not share it at all. He limited himself to repeating he would fulfill his responsibilities, nothing more. That coldness hurt, obviously, but I also reinterpreted it as one more proof nobody was willing to deal with a woman who does not erase herself to fit what is expected of a future mother. Meanwhile, the narrative installed in my environment was another very different from mine. For them, I was the pregnant woman who had not let go of an old love and was willing to use a baby to keep feeding that altar. Every time someone looked at me with pity or reproach, I locked myself more in the idea I was the only one seeing the real dimension of things. The world felt small, full of people who only wanted simple stories: ex got over, stable partner, baby with neutral name, and everyone happy. I never fit in that mold, and now I was paying for it on a large scale. Comments. Update 3. Anonymous user 1 says that all your family and environment are seeing the same thing should give you some clue. It is not that everyone is a boring moralist. It is that literally you are using your son as a stage to keep acting your role of tragic lover. And Carlos is not the gray man. He is the only one who had the courage to step away from something hurting him. Response from the OP. When everyone looks in one direction, it is normal that whoever looks differently seems wrong. My family has always been conservative on some topics, and clearly they find it easier to label me tragic lover than accept stories are not always linear. That Carlos steps away can be seen as courage, but it is also the comfortable exit of one who does not stand the discomfort of a truth he did not ask for. I'm the only one holding the complexity of this, whether they like it or not. Anonymous user 2 says, you say your messages are misinterpreted out of context, but the context is clear. You call Fernando the great love of your life, while pregnant by Carlos, and also propose the name thing. There is not much interpretation possible. You are clinging to a narrative where you are deep and others superficial, and that prevents you from seeing the real damage. Response from the OP. That I recognize what I felt with Fernando was very big, does not erase what I'm living now nor the place my son occupies. People grab onto loose words and turn them into a sentence without understanding everything behind. Clearly, it is easier to reduce it to black and white. Either you love one or love another. What I try to say is sometimes life does not work like that, and not for that reason will I deny my own story just so others feel more comfortable. Anonymous user 3 says, you complain about being seen as pathetic, but what turns out pathetic is keep defending with such vehemence something that already broke your relationship, damaged your reputation, and left the father of your son on the sidelines. At some point, depth stops being an excuse and becomes pure stubbornness. The only one ending up trapped in all this is the baby. Response from the OP. Stubbornness would be denying all this hurts me and keep acting like nothing. I at least am looking straight at the consequences, even if I do not like them. And yes, I have lost things, but I'm not going to lose also the possibility of giving meaning to what I lived just to clean my image. The baby is not trapped in anything. He is being part of a story that with time I will have to explain to him in my way. I prefer that to raising someone on a sweetened version of who I'm. Update 4. With Carlos out of the house and the family looking at me as if I were a problem they do not know where to place, the pregnancy started feeling different. The medical appointments that before were 2 were now with me alone or sometimes with my mother, accompanying me more out of obligation than enthusiasm. The belly grew, discomforts too, and days filled with uncomfortable silences. On a practical level, I lacked nothing because Carlos complied with money and expenses, but the presence, that support one is supposed to have when building a family, had simply evaporated. And in every absence, I repeated the same phrase in my head. Nobody stands a woman who does not edit herself. Conversations with my mother and some aunts became a rosary of veiled warnings. They told me I was still in time to choose another name, to think of the child future, how Carlos would feel every time he heard it. An aunt went so far as to say I was committing unnecessary cruelty, as if the birth certificate were a sort of punishment. I listened to all that while feeling my son kick and wondered at what moment everyone decided the correct way to love was erasing scars. For me, the name was no longer just Fernando. It was the proof I had not let anyone rewrite my story for comfort. The day of the delivery arrived with its own load of symbolism. Carlos was there because legally and as a father he had to be, but the distance was evident. He talked to doctors, signed papers, ensured everything was in order, but barely crossed glances with me. I, between contractions and fear, felt a mix of vulnerability and pride. Vulnerability because, clearly, nobody wants to give birth with an emotional wall next to them. Pride because even in the middle of all that cold, I knew I was doing things as I felt them, without letting them break me in the final stretch. When finally I had my son in arms, everything became very silent. There was not the typical picture of excited and reconciled couple by the baby arrival. It was me and him and around us professionals doing their job. Carlos approached, looked at him, caressed his head, but there was not that instant of family I had imagined months back. In that moment, the absence of what could have been hurt like a stab, but also reaffirmed me in something. If even the arrival of our son was not enough for him to see beyond a name, then perhaps he was never really up to the complexity I bring. The registry issue was the last visible battle. Some relatives insisted until the last second I not commit that madness, that I choose a new, neutral name, symbolizing a clean start with the real father of the child. Carlos made clear he did not agree with him being named Fernando, but also said he was not going to keep arguing, that the final decision would be mine if I insisted. In the registry office, with the form in front, I felt all eyes on me. I took a deep breath. I thought of everything that had happened, who I was with Fernando, who I was with Carlos, who I was now with that baby in arms, and wrote the name I had always had in mind. Leaving there with the certificate in hand was strange. On one hand, I knew I had just sealed something many consider unforgivable. On the other, I felt a rare peace, a feeling of having been faithful to myself until the end, even if that was costing me almost everything. Criticisms did not take long to arrive. Some said openly I was crazy, others I was condemning my son to a story he did not ask for. Every comment was one more confirmation the majority prefers easy and predictable stories. I looked at my son, called him by his name, and felt at least I was not bringing him into a life based on a comfortable lie. What nobody wants to recognize is the baby, for many, is a symbol they use to feel morally superior. They talk of protecting him, thinking of him, but actually what bothers them is I dare use my maternity to close my own narrative instead of becoming the mold they expect. I lost a partner who was willing to form a family under certain conditions. Yes, I damaged the image Fernando has in certain circles. Maybe I fractured my social circle, but I also refused to accept a script where I had to pretend my great love never existed just because now it makes people uncomfortable. Comments. Update 4. Anonymous user 1 says, you registered your son with the name Fernando, knowing perfectly all the previous damage, and still sell it as fidelity to yourself. The reality is you condemned him to be a living reminder of your obsession, both for Carlos and all the environment knowing the story. You fool yourself saying you do it for coherence, when really it is pure pride. Response from the OP. Pride would have been changing the name just so everyone stopped talking. Coherence is holding a decision even when it does not leave you looking good before anyone. Obviously, I know it is not the most comfortable option, but I also know if I had chosen another name just to soothe others' consciences, I would have betrayed myself and everything I lived. My son will grow knowing the truth, not a cut version so others feel less uncomfortable. Anonymous user 2 says, you say Carlos was not up to your complexity, but he was the only one at the delivery, signed papers, took charge economically, and stayed despite all the drama. The only thing he asked was you not put another man in the center of his son identity, and you could not even concede him that. It is not that he is simple, it is that you do not yield in anything. Response from the OP. I will not deny Carlos complied in the practical, but life is not just procedures and money. He was present physically, yes, but emotionally he disconnected long ago. I also did not ask him to change his story or fears to fit with me. He chose to protect himself. I chose to hold what I consider important. I'm not obliged to sacrifice my sense of things just because he is present in certain moments. Anonymous user 3 says, you talk about everyone using the baby as a symbol to judge you, but the first who turned him into a symbol was you by treating him as a vehicle to close your novel with Fernando. A son is not a canvas for the mother to paint her tragic tale. You could have healed your story without dragging the child to carry that weight every time someone pronounces his name. Response from the OP. A son does not arrive in a vacuum. He arrives in the life of a person with history, with wounds, with moments that defined her. Pretending all that disappears the day one becomes a mother is a lie. My son inevitably was going to form part of my story, of who I'm. I chose to be transparent with that from the beginning, even if to others it seems too much. That to you it seems a weight does not mean for him it is going to be. It will depend on how I tell him and how we build our relationship, not just what is said in low voices. Now, update 5. Several months have passed since the delivery and things have settled into a sort of rare equilibrium, almost functional, but full of distance. Carlos complies with what he said, sees Fernando regularly, helps economically, is present in important things like medical appointments or practical decisions. However, our relationship has reduced to a cold choreography. We talk schedules, vaccines, diapers, but there is no trace of the couple we once thought we were. When he is home, he focuses on the child and barely addresses a word to me. It is noticeable he is making an effort to separate his role of father from everything he thinks of me. In the wider environment, the majority has opted to treat me with caution. They do not attack me directly, but there are silences saying everything. Some friends moved away, others only appear to see the baby and leave fast, as if fearing getting trapped in my supposed madness. In family gatherings, when someone pronounces my son's name, a small creak is felt in the atmosphere. Nobody says anything openly, but I know what they think. I have become that story told quietly when someone mentions extreme decisions during pregnancy. On social networks, I found a sort of refuge. I upload photos of Fernando, his hands, his eyes, the small things of day-to-day, accompanied by phrases about loves transcending time and lives arriving to remind us of those no longer here. For many that will be kitsch, dramatic, exaggerated. For me, it is a way to build a story where my son is not just the product of a breakup, but a bridge between what I was and what I'm. And yes, sometimes those phrases are directed indirectly to Fernando, the ex, although he no longer sees them. It is my way of closing circles others refuse to understand, because Fernando and Daniela are no longer here. They left the city some time ago, I suppose tired of the noise generated. They blocked me everywhere, even accounts where I did not even follow him directly. The message is clear. They want to erase any trace of my existence from their new life. I could say that destroyed me, but actually I saw it coming. When someone decides to embrace normality at all costs, anything or person reminding them of the opposite becomes a problem to eliminate. I represent everything they do not want to see in the mirror. From time to time, someone who still dares speak with honesty asks me if it would not have been healthier to choose a new name, build a proper story with Carlos as real father of the child. They say it from a mix of concern and tiredness, as if still keeping hope. I recognize I made a mistake. I answer them, already without desire to debate, that the world prefers mediocre stories, those where everything fits, to true ones, that not everyone has the courage to hold a story that is uncomfortable. Some stay silent, others change the subject. Fewer and fewer insist. What I have learned in these months is my victimhood, as many call it, no longer moves anyone. And even so, it continues being the way I understand what happened. I see myself as someone who paid a high price for not rewriting her life to make it digestible. I lost a stable partner. Yes, I lost friends, reputation, possibility of a conventional family, but every time I look at my son and call him by his name, I feel at least I did not betray myself. The rest of the world can label me as they want. I will keep living in this story I built, even if that means I will always be the one who suffers too much and changes little. Comments. Update 5. Anonymous user 1 says, "You say you did not betray yourself, but neither did you make the minimum gesture of empathy towards Carlos nor towards your own son. Calling mediocre those who would have chosen a neutral name does not make you deep, only keeps you enclosed in a martyr pose nobody buys anymore. The only one still trapped in that novel is you." Response from the OP. Empathy is not synonymous with giving up everything. One is to calm others. I understand Carlos and others feel uncomfortable, but not for that reason will I rewrite my story to fit their idea of normality. If for you that is a pose, it is fine, but at least it is coherent with what I feel. I prefer being the one staying in an uncomfortable story to being one of those people changing script according to who is watching. Anonymous user 2 says, "You talk of your son as a bridge between what you were and what you are, but barely mention what he needs now and in the future. You are building him an identity where he will always be tied to an ex he never knew and a drama he did not ask for. When he grows up and hears the story, he is not going to think his mother was brave. He is going to ask himself why he was never enough by himself. Response from the OP. Nobody knows how a son is going to interpret his parents' story. There are also children raised in lies who later feel robbed of the truth. I will choose to tell him in a way he understands his name forms part of a chain of events leading me to him, not a competition between men. That some of you only see the drama does not mean he is going to see it the same way. Anonymous User 3 says, "It bothers you Fernando and Daniela erased you from their life, but honestly, what did you expect? You played with the limits of their relationship, used your pregnancy as excuse to get into their dynamic and now are surprised they want distance. It is not they flee intensity, it is you do not understand when to let go of something that already ended." Response from the OP. It does not surprise me they left. It only confirms what I already suspected. They prefer tranquility to facing something uncomfortable. I approached from a place that for me was honest, maybe clumsy, but honest in the end. If their way of handling it was disappearing and erasing every trace, it is their choice. I'm not going to live asking forgiveness eternally for having felt something in a different way to the one you consider acceptable.